So we're going live now. 3, 2, 1, and we are live.
All right. So I'm going to check real quick. Looking at the Zoom video. It's going to start in just a bit on the YouTube channel. So I see that we're about to go live there. And then I just want to check before we begin, is everybody seeing everyone else? Perfect. Well, welcome to our neurodiversity in sci-fi panel and in fantasy. Okay, so one thing before we begin, Raidah is going to join us in just a bit. She is brilliant. She is wonderful. She writes diverse fantasy that she wants her kids to be able to see themselves in one day, which I think we can all appreciate. And so she is going to join us when her wonderful kids get to go to school and childcare. So she'll be on in just a moment. And with that, I want to say welcome to everybody joining us today. And I am going to start out with introductions for everybody who's here at the moment. Connor, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, right. Hey, I am Connor Caplan. I'm a quadruplet. I've got autism, OCD, ADHD. I wrote The Sword in the Street, which was a self-published fantasy blog off semi-finalist last year, in spite of the fact that I'm unfortunately mediocre at best when it comes to introductions.
You do fabulously. And speaking of someone also fabulous at introductions, we're going to go next to Darby.
I'm not fabulous at it, but I'll try. I'm Darby Harn. I'm the author of the Eververse series, a speculative fiction series about autistic superhero Kit Baldwin. One reviewer called it the next logical step after Watchmen, which made me very happy because I'm a huge comic book nerd. So.
Wonderful. I think that's a high compliment and well-deserved. All right, next we've got one of our pinch hitters today who can cover any topic on demand. Rachel, do you want to give us an introduction?
Sure. I'm Rachel Rener. This is Terrence. He's my emotional support animal. Not for me. I support him because he would be screaming in the background if he wasn't a part of this. So I am a contemporary fantasy author. I like to blur the line between science and magic. Those are things that I'm very passionate about. I also have a handful of acronyms, namely ADHD, but I also tend to flirt with GAD and MDD and any other acronym that may be seasonally applicable.
I like it. Can we ask Terrence any questions today? Is he contributing to the panel?
Absolutely. Mostly he'll just be trying to get head scratches from me.
Fantastic. We support this completely. Next, we're going to have our second pinch hitter of the day. Caro, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, my name is Caro. I'm an agented writer of literary fiction and speculative fiction. And although I don't have books published yet, I was part of the amazing autistic anthology as an artist and illustrator called Sensory. It's going to be out on fall 22. Yeah, fall 22. It's this year. Yeah. I'm a Brazilian. I'm a Brazilian living in Portugal for 3 years now. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I just try to write stuff that has all of my identities in it because I feel the lack of it in the world. So I'm just trying my best. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I like that. I like that so much. Caro and Al share the ability to not only write beautifully, but also draw beautifully. I am envious. And so, Al, we're going to you next. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Al Hess. I write cozy science fiction, usually with heavy queer romance threads. I have 2 self-published series, and I'm also agented and recently had a book out on Sub. I can't talk anymore about how that's going, but I'm really happy with the journey so far. I am also a portrait artist, and I do a lot of character art, both of my own characters and my friends and authors that I enjoy. I'm autistic and I'm also trans, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, well, wonderful. Dianna, round us out for us.
All right, I am Dianna Gunn. I am a writer of fantasy and science fiction with horror elements. This is my dragon Rolf. He is from my book. and was actually sent to me by a friend all the way from New Zealand, which is just wild.
Yes.
I have a collection of acronyms, mostly ADHD and, depression, flirting with anxiety of varying kinds over the years, and PTSD. And I also run the Spoonie Authors podcast, where we feature disabled and neurodivergent authors.
Well, fantastic. I'll close us out here. I'm Pine. Just Pine works. I come from the land where it snowed yesterday in April. So, we're still wondering about what the weather's doing out here today. I publish a lot of short stories that have the rep I want to see. I identify as autistic and I'm trying to get an ADHD diagnosis, but we all know how that goes for adults. So that is where I'm coming from today. I'm going to be the moderator. I'm going to ask the interesting questions and I'm going to keep us rolling. But first, I'm going to remind everybody in the audience today that we do have a 99 cents and free book sale going on, where you can look into more about these fabulous authors we have on our panel. And also, you are welcome to follow any of us on our social media, which you should be able to find in the information on YouTube. If you can't, follow up with us later and we will get you that information, because you should absolutely follow the wonderful people we have here. So with that, we are going to start out with one of my favorite topics from one of my favorite authors, neurodivergent people in romance, because we don't get that rep enough. If we're on the page, we often are not the love interest or fallen in love. So we're going to go to an author who writes that and whose books really do contain those cozy neurodivergent romance arcs. Al, take us away. What do you think on that topic?
Thanks, Pine. Well, I think there's a misconception that neurodiverse people can't be sexy, or that they aren't interested in having relationships, that they don't have kids, and it's ridiculous. But these sorts of things are prevalent. They might struggle to form connections in a neurotypical way, or have barriers that they or their romantic interests have to, understand and work through, but that doesn't make them any less capable of love, friendship, or romance. And I feel like being autistic feels so isolating at times. Like, everybody has the handbook for communication and social navigation except for you. And the way that we show our affection might be different than what a neurotypical person is expecting. Mm-hmm. For instance, I have no idea when someone is flirting with me unless it's like really super obvious. And my idea of flirting would be info dumping about my special interests and wanting to know about theirs, which, doesn't often go over very well with neurotypical people. They're not going to be on that same wavelength. But so for instance, art is a huge communication form for me. I feel like it's a better tool for me to convey how I feel about a person than just trying to talk to them with my words. Mm-hmm. And so people I admire, my friends, my favorite authors, people that I'm romantically interested in, they always end up getting art from me, because that's the best way that I can show, my interest and my respect for them. And my characters' methods of communication in my stories are often similar. It's, sharing a rare book that they've never let anyone else see. It's info dumping astronomy facts. It's bringing over their favorite kind of pie. And even if that isn't something that a neurotypical romance reader expects, it's honest and authentic to the character that I'm writing. And I think that that's the most important, that I don't want to always keep the neurotypical gaze in mind. Like, I want it to be an authentic neurodiverse character.
Yeah, I really, really like that, because too often when we are represented, it's represented as a stereotype of what neurotypical people think we should look like. Yeah. And so Darby and I have actually talked about this before. Darby, you and I have spoken not only about what it's like to write while neurodivergent, but also writing good neurodivergent rep. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the wonderful things you and I have spoken about?
Yeah, I think I'll co-sign what Al said, which is always a good strategy.
Darby writes great romance too.
Thank you, Al. I think the biggest thing that I find challenging, certainly as myself, as I found out about being autistic later in life, is this concept, the stereotype, which is very harmful, very destructive, that autistic people are emotionless or have no feelings or are not empathetic. And my experience is not that. It's not that personally. It's not that with other people. And my actual experience is that autistic people tend to be hyper empathetic and hyper perceptive in many ways. And the more you perceive and the more you're aware, the more empathetic you are to other people's situations. And so I wanted to reflect that in my writing. And I think I've tried to do that in my books, particularly with Kit and Kit's relationship with her girlfriend, Abby. Abby is hyper in every way, and Kit is not, but the two of them together kind of find their way. But Kit is someone who has a great well of emotion and feeling that just doesn't really get out. It doesn't really get out in a neurotypical way. And one of the biggest things that, the biggest benefits of realizing this and writing these characters has been finding this out in myself and finding new ways of expressing myself, like Al said, through different means that are more to me, and they're not, in the past I might have considered myself limited or in some way, and I don't anymore. My limitations aren't limitations, and none of ours are. So I try to reflect that as best I can in my writing.
Can you give us a little example about how this comes out in your writing? You were talking a bit about the hyperness and the empatheticness, but give us a little more. I'm interested.
I think for Kit is someone she's always, her sort of physical tick, she's always biting her lip because she's always wants to say something. She doesn't know what to say, and that she's taught herself not to speak because it never comes out right. With Abby, she just has to listen. And then listening is actually, in myself personally, has become, I feel like I've always been a good listener, but I think I can honestly say I never really listened to anything, to people, to movies, to music, because I would just play music over and over again. I don't know that I'm actually listening to it. And
that
so,
music is stimming, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but now in my advanced stage, I'm listening, and I find that very enjoyable, and I try to reflect that in the writing. And it's an ongoing thing, so it's, if you were to start at the beginning and read your way through it, it changes, but I try to.
I think that's very valid, because I find myself doing something very similar, which is just listening to people tell me about what they're super interested in or working on, and letting that go on for 30 minutes without necessarily saying too much back. It's an expression of care that we don't often see in neurotypical relationships, where we see this kind of ping-ponging instead. Now, Rachel, you and I have talked about some of the representation ways you show neurodivergent rep and authenticity in your writing. Can you tell me and the audience a little bit about a scene where you feel your character was authentic and it really came across? Oh, I think you're on mute, dear. Okay, give us 1 second. We've got this. Terrence is doing his best to entertain while we get off mute, and we support him completely.
Totally support him. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was going to say, my characters, I don't actually call them out as having ADHD or having anxiety or anything else that I feel like I can represent through my writing. But for those of us who are neurodivergent, when you pick up my books, and I think even people who aren't necessarily neurodivergent will read it and say, I know someone like this. And I think, it's kind of a way to normalize it without making it about that. So, I have a recent book called Inked, who has a parrot in there, by the way, who's loosely based on this guy. And I think particularly in modern and urban fantasy, there's this trend of seeing female protagonists who are just perfect at just about everything. And I hate the term Mary Sue because I think it's kind of inherently sexist. But you do see a lot of just super capable protagonists. So this protagonist that I wrote, her name is Talia. She is Jewish like me, so yay, representation. She's a mess, man, but she's lovable. She's not necessarily great at stuff, she's super artistic. She's very empathetic because, Darby, I agree with you. I do think that people, the autistic people who I know are extremely sensitive and empathetic, and same with people with ADHD like me. And so, she just kind of has these moments, and there is, one scene in particular where she's a tattoo artist who's afraid of needles aimed at herself, not other people. And she actually has to give her a tattoo because that's the magic system in my book. And she falls apart, man. Maybe another neurotypical person would say, all right, a few deep breaths. No, she's a mess. Like, she's a total mess. She falls apart just like I would if I was in that situation. Like, if you had to put me in a room with spiders, I'd be a disaster. But she does it, and she's gallant about it. So
I like that. You know, I feel like we don't get enough complicated neurodivergent rep. I feel like we get a lot of expectations that we have to be perfect because we're the only neurodivergent rep somebody's going to see for the next 40 books. So we might as well be flawless. Yeah. And so, Caro, you had talked to me about this previously, and you had a lot of good thoughts on it. Could you talk to me about some of this deep, realistic neurodivergent rep that can be a little bit complicated too?
Of course. You know, sorry. Something that always comes to my mind is that, you know, the first thing I did when I was writing my book was literally not think about it. Because when I did begin to write that book that is on Sub, by the way, I miss it so much. And I'm sorry in advance for talking about it, but I didn't know.
One sec, real quick.
Okay.
We're gonna give a warm, fabulous welcome
Hello.
to Raidah. Thank you for
Hi.
joining us.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi, Raidah.
We gave you a fabulous introduction earlier.
Oh, thank you. I wish I could have heard it, but anyway.
No worries. We said that you were absolutely brilliant, writing books with the rep you wanted your children to see so they could see themselves when they read it. And we're just absolutely thrilled that you could join us. And right now, Caro is talking about complicated neurodivergent rep and how we are real people and not just one perfect little box. Caro, please continue.
No problem. Welcome, Raidah. Good to see you. Well, about the topic, when I began writing my book, I wasn't aware that I was autistic, and my way of writing my main character, Astorius, was basically like, I wanted to see someone who was just like me. And because of it, he made a lot of mistakes, and he does commit a lot of mistakes, and that's normal because we are people, we are human, and we commit mistakes too. And like Rachel was saying something very interesting about allowing our characters to be messy, to be who they are, and to be who we also are. And I think that's the point of it. Like, and she also said something that, I'm sorry for being so sparse.
Oh, please.
I like it.
Okay. Rachel said something very interesting too about like, we are gonna figure out some stuff that neurotypical people might not, without having to say my character is autistic, my character is ADHD. Like, there's some stuff that is really personal to us, and this personal touches sprinkle into a story makes it all really magical. And when I think it,
do you have any suggestions about personal touches that have made you go, I'm gonna headcanon this character this way?
Yeah, I do. My personal way of stimming is like, I have a necklace and I can't stop doing this to it. When I have a clock, and I love clocks, it's my special interest. I can get away with watches. That's what I do for a living too. So like, I usually carry a pocket watch, and I keep like doing this with it. And that's something that my character does. Or for example, when he, it's on his way of speaking. It's on his way of caring for his special one. It's the way how he felt when he lost someone who was special. And that's the kind of little things you put in the story that are not like, someone who is neurotypical might not react that way, but we do. And even if we don't, because we are a huge spectrum, we can see how it affects us differently. And I think that's beautiful. And allowing our and allowing our characters to be messy too. For example, I don't like the way the neurotypicals portray meltdowns or shutdowns. I think there's a huge history of using this against us. We have our own ways of displaying that. And sometimes it's not like, oh, it's not something really big to neurotypical people, sorry, but it's really big to us. It impacts us deeply, and it's not the way they expect. So,
Yeah, I think those are all really good points because on some hand, I totally understand that you may not want to just make it super obvious to a neurotypical person that this character is autistic, because on one hand, it's kind of like trying to write to people who have no idea. You have to almost handhold them a lot. And, you know, Connor has spoken to me so passionately about this topic, about when to write for the neurotypical gaze and when to just write for our community. And he had a lot of good points on it. So Connor, we're coming to you.
Yeah, so like a lot of the stuff I write is like, obviously I want neurotypical people to get like something out of this. So there's sort of the standard exposition you got to do like for their sake, like the general, like, well, yes, we do have empathy sort of thing, you know? And it's like, it's almost like explaining a magic system or any other kind of world building. You just kind of got to get that out of the way up front just to establish it. But like, I don't necessarily think of that balance a whole lot, because the main reason I write the things that I write is because I think I have a perspective on a lot of this that I think a lot of people who are a part of my in-group need to hear. And it's like the kind of thing that I don't think they'd accept from someone who wasn't a part of that in-group, where it's like, hey, you there, like, come close. Like, you already know we have empathy. So let's dig into these experiences a little deeper and like deepen the conversation a bit. I think there's some lessons we can kind of learn here. Like, as an example, like, I used to be the kind of like autistic person who would sort of haughtily go like, oh, I'm actually better than a lot of neurotypicals at communicating because unlike them, I know how to be direct. But like, if no one was coming at me directly, I was completely out of my element. I had no idea what to do. And it took a long time to learn like, oh, if I'm only good at communicating when someone's using like my preferred communication style, maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought I was. Or like, I had a autistic sort of former friend who would go like a lot of the time and be like, nobody communicates with me and everyone is part of this problem and that's everyone's fault but mine. And like, they wouldn't really understand the idea that in order for people to communicate with you, you first need to demonstrate that you're a safe person to be communicated with, and blaming everyone but yourself for any failure of communication or not coming at it any different from the previous times you've tried it isn't what's going to get people to tell you what's wrong. And like, after a while, the kinds of things I started to write sort of focused on the narratives I wish I could have had earlier in life, or that I wish other people could have taken on board. And it's the kinds of things that I think people in my in-group could really much benefit from hearing, which means usually I have to get a lot of that exposition out of the way up front, so that I can get into like the meat of my experiences with autism and write about like some flawed, fucked up autistic boys having flawed and fucked up relationships. But it's something I want to write about like with empathy, because like if the narrative of neurodiversity only leaves room for complication with villainization, I think it loses a degree of humanity. I think it's far more important to pay attention to the narrative that I think my people kind of need to hear, and just to spend worrying about what neurotypical people are going to think about me. And so I try to write a lot about complicated autistic people who can be kind of fucked up without really being the villains of the piece.
Yeah, I think that is a super, like, there's so many good follow-up points to make on this. Like, I know that Dianna, who we're going to go to in just a little bit, has so many good points about when it comes to what accommodations different people need, and communication can touch on that a little bit. Like, I don't know why anyone is tired of the miscommunication plot. There are so many neurodivergent spins you can put on that. But since I know that Rachel's got just like a 30-second short thought on that communication style, I want to give her just a moment to respond from a different point of view.
Actually, no, I was just going to say that blunt, direct talking, Connor. I've written like 10 books now, but my debut book, its weakness was I just needed to tell people what they needed to know. And it really took me some time to realize that I needed to learn how to be subtle and let them sort of like read between lines. And that's really hard for me to do, but it made me a better writer, but I had to kind of overcome that ADHD hurdle to do it.
That really,
go ahead.
Like, oh no, just like there's like a lot of neurodiversity, I think, tends to influence your voice and the way you come at like writing. And there's a degree of you need to be able to sort of adapt what you're saying in a way that's going to make it very like build the kind of empathy you want to achieve with, depending on what your goals are for the scene.
Yep.
All right, so Dianna, you have patiently waited to give us some of your brilliant thoughts when it comes to different accommodations and different styles. So what are your thoughts on this?
So the first thing I want to say is that it's really important to consider neurodiversity as part of your world building and accessibility as part of your world building. But it's also important to broaden your definition of accessibility, because even within one disability, one neurodivergence, there are a huge range of different accommodations that you might need. And these can be things that are built into the world, like, places that have low sensory zones that people can step into, or outside spaces that people can escape to. And it can also be things that are established through character communication, that it's like, okay, well, if you and I live together and I'm the type of person who, my ADHD means that I get distracted heavily when seeing subtitles on a screen, but your ADHD means that you don't hear things, you miss a lot of things if you don't have subtitles. Well, then we have to communicate. These are just little things that are built into character relationships and into their worlds. And I think it would change the face of science fiction and fantasy if more writers considered this early on in their world building and development processes. Because I feel like for a lot of us, we're not used to seeing those things represented, and we're not used to those people being there, even if we are those people. And so by default, we don't include those things. I myself, in my first book, there's not really a lot of that. And I worked really hard to make sure that more of those things were visible in my second book.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I mean, these are really good points. Do you have any books that you recommend where you're like, this one has always stuck with me? I wish I saw more people do it like this person did.
Oh, goodness. I mean, the only one that comes to mind is Life in the Cosm by Kat Gordon, my dear friend Kat. I can think of more examples of where they did it wrong, even in books that are by other means. The world building is extremely progressive, and you notice that disability was just casually left out, or you'll even have some like offhanded comment about bad genes, and you're just like, that feels out of place in this extremely, feminist fiction. Otherwise, like, I'm very confused about where I am all of a sudden.
No, I mean, there is a real problem with people thinking that disabled people would just not exist in the future in sci-fi or not survive in fantasy. And my goodness, like the number of people who come out of the weeds on Twitter to tell me like, you can't have an autistic character in your fantasy world because they would be dead for some reason. And I'm just like, y'all. So on the note of representation, because my goodness, we need more of it. Raidah, let's go to you. You are brilliant. Take us away.
Thank you, Pine. So representation in terms of an autistic Muslim, hijabi, Malay, Australian person is my book because I haven't read it. I haven't read it in mainstream fiction, and I'm always hungry for that rep. I always get excited seeing any autistic rep to begin with, but by and large, it's often very white, very cis, very male, and not at all relatable, and often very unpleasant. I didn't realize I was autistic until one of my children got diagnosed. So that was and is a tremendous gift of being an autistic mother to an autistic child. But it really bothered me. Like I couldn't understand why I was so drawn to these characters. On one hand, I was like, this seems really familiar, but also really off. So many years later, I'm like, oh, that's why. Okay, I get it now. That makes so much sense. Why I keep asking my neurotypical husband, like, what are the rules for this situation? And it's a lot harder for women like me who have multiple identities and we belong to so many different spheres. Because when I present, like, oh, you look normal, therefore the expectations are harder. And it's such a difficult place to be in. When I'm a writer, I just want to write the joy of existing alongside the struggle, and not just be this source of disability porn and inspiration porn. Let's save the oppressed brown woman. It's like, no, please let me speak and tell my own story, even if it means that you as the consumer need to work harder to understand it. It doesn't mean that I am passive. That is such a trigger word for me, because there are so many ways of existing and moving throughout the world that have nothing to do with colonizing. There are ways of relating and communicating and honoring different traditions and making space for all of it. But if the predominant model of media consumption is very much, like shoot, kill, bang, bang, and blow things up, and we are the saviors of everyone else, I come along with a very different story, it would be pretty jarring, So in essence, like a quiet book by an autistic woman who comes from diaspora or from a different country, who's Malay, Australian like me, would be pretty shocking, for entirely different reasons. And I hope that as I keep writing, and while raising my children, who hilariously are like one of the active saboteurs of my writing, because mama, it's like, oh my gosh, please give me time to write. I hope that there'll come a time where there'll be more and more voices and faces like mine. And it won't just be like, oh, what are you doing here? You speak good English. So annoying, so yeah.
All right, I like that. There's so many good points in there. What I'm going to do is, because we've got about 15 minutes left before I open this to questions on YouTube, and I'm going to check for questions on YouTube real quick, but anyone who's got a question for something that our panelists have already said or something they want us to talk about, go ahead and drop it in the YouTube chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start kind of our group question rounds. Clearly, my outsiders do not want me to start the group question rounds because they are making me have a squirrel moment by driving past with large trucks. So I'll go on mute in just a moment, but we're going to do a kind of 1 minute per answer round. And I want Caro to start us off. Caro, you were saying earlier that you really emphasized with what another panelist was saying. Could you go into that more? Lead us into this 1 minute question section.
Sure. I kind of got lost on what I was gonna say, but I have two different things to say about it. Sorry, I'm ill again. One of them is what was said about the idea that we wouldn't exist in the future, or that we wouldn't exist in a fantasy world, in a fantasy setting. And I think this is really interesting, and I want to hear. I think it was Dianna who said that. Was it? I have a terrible memory, but I think it was you. I think we could hear a bit more about your solutions on it. I say this as writing a story in the future with multiple neurodiverse characters, and I would like to dive deeper into the subject if it was possible. And then if it was possible, I would like to ask something Raidah too.
Yeah. Well, perfect. Who wants to take that?
I can start.
Okay.
So I mean, I do think a lot of it is just like actually considering it. I think a lot of us do get caught up sort of in like what the genre expectations are, and especially in, I feel like, fantasy more so than science fiction, there's just this assumption that everything is white and straight and kind of bigoted. And I think just pushing yourself beyond that that association is the first big step. And then the other thing is to really like listen to a lot of neurodivergent folks about what accommodations make them feel more comfortable in a space. Pay attention to what accommodations are being offered at events that you're at. Notice what tools people use to, function in their day-to-day lives, what things people use as stims, what things people use to, organize chaos brain. All of these things, like, yes, in some instances, it's not going to necessarily be applicable because, the technology doesn't exist in your fantasy world. But there's really also like, if you have magic, a lot of the time you can just make that thing exist in some other way. And in science fiction, you can just make a more advanced version of that. And that's something I would love to see more of, is like super high-tech versions of accessibility things that already exist.
Yes, that's my thing. Is too often we think people in the past had no solutions for folks with disabilities, no prosthetics, no care, no notice that our brains work a little differently. And I'm just going, y'all, just because it was 200 years ago did not mean people would not exist and would not notice and would not have a solution. So would it be as good as a solution? We got magic. We'll figure it out.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. So Raidah, I saw you nodding just a little bit and you seemed like you were thinking. You got it? What's on your mind?
I mean, I love fantasy, obviously. I love sci-fi. And I love the idea of how like pre-colonial community building and roles were already there long ago. And right now in the present and writing in the future, it's all about tapping back into a tradition that was already ours. And it's already there, it's already rich. It's just like scraping back all that ableism and all that stuff, you know. And I love the idea of one day writing that fantasy based in Malaysia or Singapore, Southeast Asia, what it would be like to imagine disability being something that is just part of life, you know, not something that is either like excised completely out of the story or put on a pedestal in this really awkward way, just simply a mode of being, a mode of existing that is respected and given due care and compassion, not in an infantilizing way, but in a way of like empowerment. Like, you know, what do you need? How can I support you? You know, how can I give you space? How can I give you support? These kinds of conversations right from birth. That would be great support from that point.
Absolutely.
Right through the whole spectrum of life, through all the rituals that we have. You know, and I love that idea of fantasy being a really exciting place to imagine possibilities that might have already existed, but we kind of lost touch with for various reasons. So yeah, I love that idea of fantasy being freeing in that way.
You know, I genuinely enjoy that because there are moments of that ring true and that I wish were true in my own life. And especially if we are creating the world, we can absolutely make a thing and change the way that readers think, because readers do tend to carry their own biases with them. And speaking with carrying their own biases, Al, you and I have spoken previously on whether or not to outwardly declare a character is neurodivergent or just show it. And, you know, if some people notice, great. And if some people don't notice because they don't know the signs, that's not our responsibility always to make sure they notice. So Al, what were you thinking as you were listening to all this?
So I don't know that I have an answer to this because I've gone both ways in my books, either disclosing neurodivergence or just showing it. But this has been on my mind lately. One of my self-published books, Mazarine Blues, my main character, Reed, is autistic, but I wrote him as autistic before I knew I was autistic. I just gave him these traits that I had, and he has a severe anxiety disorder. And it's not until book 2 that he realizes that he's autistic. But anyway, I know I shouldn't be looking at my reviews, but sometimes I do. And most people like Reed, but what I see quite commonly too is that they think that he's weird and annoying. And that kind of feels like a personal jab because it's like they're saying I'm weird and annoying because I've given him these traits that I have. And it made me wonder, if I had disclosed that he's autistic in the first book, would they still think of him as weird and annoying? Or they would say, oh, he's just autistic. Or would it make it worse? Would they already have these preconceived notions of how he's going to be because he's neurodivergent? And I don't have an answer for that, but it's just something that I've been thinking about lately.
It is something that I find a lot of authors who write that authentic rep struggle with as well, because there's a book, The Unkindness of Ghosts, that made me feel so seen because it was the first time I read a genderqueer, neurodiverse character so well done and so authentic that I literally stopped and was like, oh my goodness, some books that I never thought could get published could get published. But when I checked the reviews, there were some people who got it and were complimentary, and there were some reviewers who stereotyped, had no patience. And there's just this, it's something that's talked about with a lot of diversities, but there is a penalty in reviews for diversity. Now, Connor, you have published books and you have written about these neurodivergent characters. What do you find when it comes to reviewers and being authentic, whether or not you reveal a character is neurodivergent? What's your experience with that?
Largely pretty positive. I'm not gonna lie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there are any compounding factors to this, but I'm usually pretty open about like being mentally disabled. In the only book I've ever written, or at least the only one I have out, I don't necessarily give out any sort of diagnoses, but just from reading the point of view, it's kind of like, you get it, it's there. Like even people who don't like have anything sort of really going on usually can kind of get there's something happening here. I tried not to specify what it is, but like even in the world, people are like, this guy's not all like he's. I think the way I described it was off kilter. One of my favorite reviews came from, I think, Justin Gross, who wrote, I've never seen a more realistic representation of mental health in a work of fiction. And I don't know if it's just from being like out and just sort of like out of like being loud about the kinds of stuff that I've got going on, or the way I ended up writing it, or the kinds of people who are picking the book up. But like, I don't get that many like bad reactions. The worst I've gotten so far has just been some people who get reductive about things. And so far that's been there have been very few that's been very few and far between, basically.
I'm so glad to hear that your experiences with reviews have mostly been positive. Darby, you were talking earlier about finding things out about yourself as you were writing your characters. Do you have anything to add onto the ongoing conversation about what to diagnose specifically versus what to just show and what to let the character be?
Yeah, the biggest challenge for me in my life, both as a writer and as a person, has been whether or not to acknowledge this. And so mostly because I found out about 5 years ago, and it's been a process of getting to this point now where I'm speaking about it publicly for the first time, and it's only slightly nauseous, and that's just a product of the way I grew up. You just don't talk about yourself. But I don't initially acknowledge it in the early books with Kit in the Eververse, and I regret some of that because Kit is internalized some ableism that she reflects, and there's very little counter to it early on. It's honest in the sense that it was accurate to where I was, and that's changed. So in the most recent books, it's become textual. It's become part of the conversation in a way that, like I was saying earlier about in terms of listening, I think also speaking. I think finding your voice, finding your way of acknowledging yourself, accepting yourself, and bringing that inherent beauty that you have to the world.
I think that is amazing. That is a good summary of your personal experiences and how you see things. So Rachel, you are our pinch hitter. You are our closer until we go into questions, which are going to be the kind of quick group question rounds. You spoke earlier about how you don't really diagnose on the page. You just let characters be. Do you have any advice for people who are not neurodivergent, who are writing these neurodivergent characters, when they should just let characters be versus when they should diagnose?
Well, I think first of all, if you're going to write a neurodivergent character and you're not neurodivergent, by all means do it. I'm not about gatekeeping, but don't base it on what you see in the movies. Don't base it on what you assume: autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety. Don't do that. Go find people who have it. And because we're all willing to talk about it for the most part, there's still, I think, probably a little bit of shame. Like Darby, I really empathized with you. There's a lot of stereotyping out there. And so I don't always know when to tell people I'm a little bit different. I think they know I'm different. Sometimes it helps to acknowledge it. Sometimes I think that it changes their opinion about me. But yeah, that just goes right back to the books. If you're a neurotypical person writing a neurodivergent character, go make some friends with some neurodivergent people. Go spend some time with that crowd and go ask them what it's like before you go ahead and make an assumption, because you're not going to get it right. And not only neurodivergent people, but your readers in general, they'll pick up on it. It's not authentic.
See, this is why you're our pinch hitter. You perfectly transitioned us into the group question and answered it before I even asked. So we are going to go into the question I most commonly hear. I get it all the time on Twitter. I get it all the time when I am sharing stories about my experience. And we touch on it a little bit. The main question we've got in the comments right now is about when to write neurodivergent villains. And we're going to get there. But as a transition into that, we're going to talk a little bit about how each of us in 30 seconds or less feels about when to write neurodivergent main characters, because there is a lot of people who want to, and there is a lot of people who, depending on, things, maybe shouldn't. So for me, I'm okay if a neurotypical person wants to write a well thought out neurodivergent side character. If they're going to take up room about putting a neurodivergent main character, I am a little touchy on that. I do know that while we've been in here, we've heard from a lot of people who did self-discovery through writing these characters. They found out more about themselves. So I'm not going to say 100% of the time, do not, if you are identifying as neurotypical, but I am going to have some big questions, and I'm going to say 99% of the time, I don't want to see a neurotypical person taking opportunities from neurodivergent authors with main characters that are not like them. So with that, I see, Caro, you're nodding your head. On this topic, what do you think? Should neurotypical people be writing neurodivergent main characters?
No, but I'm gonna get to that. My personal opinion, and it comes from someone who, okay, I didn't actually write my main character as autistic because I write him more as if me, but I understand what you're saying, Pine, and I agree, because writing has a power of making us discover more about ourselves. And if you want to write a neurotypical main character that is well thought, and that you start to see the resemblances to yourself, okay, that's a thing. But I would rather see secondary characters that are autistic, well thought, that they have a place in the plot that is not exactly like stereotypicalized. And there's also a very important point that probably I won't be able to go deeper into now, but is the fact that sometimes you can't really come out as autistic. For example, I cannot display that for personal reasons and not exactly cultural reasons, but because I'm an immigrant, so it's not like, there are places and there are places. So it's hard to go on this subject because it enters on the own voices thingy. I forgot the word, sorry.
Word.
Yeah, but you kind of understand what I mean. So yes, if you are neurotypical and you want to write a main character that is autistic, be mindful of that, because you might be taking places from us. And yeah, that's basically it. So.
I think that is, so a lot of privileged folks don't understand that there are many reasons you can't be out as autistic or neurodivergent in another way. For instance, some countries will not let you immigrate if you have a diagnosis, that they will use it as a reason to refuse you. But earlier, I saw Raidah really nodding her head about like, this is resonating with me. So Raidah, I want to go to you next really quickly in about 30 seconds. What do you think? Should neurotypical people be writing main characters who are neurodivergent?
My gut instinct is like, no.
I get it.
And but definitely after listening to everybody else, like I would say, I totally agree. If you want to write a neurodivergent secondary character, go for it. With strong caveats, like send it to a sensitivity reader, speak to actually neurodivergent people, like do your homework. But if you are neurotypical and you're determined to write a neurodivergent character, like ask yourself why. Why are you trying to do this? Why are you trying to do this when actually autistic people like me are struggling to get our stories out because we don't fit the mold or what it's supposed to be like, So if you have that neurotypical privilege, sure, you can be an ally, you can uplift our voices, but don't talk for us. We have our own voices. Thank you very much. We have our own stories, our own nuances, our own your spirituality, heritage. We already exist and we will continue to exist. We have children, we marry, we teach them. We have rituals and traditions. Like, we exist amidst a whole lot of pain sometimes, but we're here and we'll continue to be here. So if you want to write an autistic character, don't do it for diversity points because it's cool to, get the attraction of like agents and editors, because what they're looking for anyway is authenticity. And if I, an actually autistic Muslim woman of color, can still struggle in this industry, that's something to think about, right? Like, check your privilege, and use it for the right reasons.
Absolutely. Now, Dianna, I saw things were resonating with you. I saw the head nod, the amen feeling. So what are you thinking on this topic, this neurotypical people writing neurodivergent main characters topic?
I mean, I think the big thing is to examine why, and also to consider like when it happens, because also like the first thing is, if you are coming from a perspective of I want to give voice to the voiceless, that's just offensive. You're wrong. Please stop.
Right.
Just stop. Just stop. We have voices. We are literally speaking right now. We are here. We are fully able to speak for ourselves. Some of us might have to do it with sign language or writing or some other mechanism, but we have ways to communicate our own thoughts and feelings. If that is what you're trying to do, that's not correct. But I also understand that sometimes characters evolve in ways that we don't expect. I wrote a short story where the love interest was a woman of color, and in my head I had always had the main character being a white woman, but I got to the end and it was just wrong. I just knew in my bones that she was not a white lady. And that means, sending it to sensitivity readers and doing a whole bunch more work. But I just knew in my bones that to have her be a white lady would be a complete disservice to the character and completely dishonest. And sometimes that happens, and we have to honor our characters and our stories and their realities. But again, that means finding people who share that reality and spending a lot of time doing research and talking to them and getting sensitivity edits done.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to say I appreciate how you were like, okay, if this is going to happen, I'm going to do my absolute best to get it right. It's one of those things where if you're going to proceed, if you were like, I've got to do this, then at the very least, do not charge head first of, I know this is what it's going to be like. I know what I have to do. Absolutely run it by many people, because we have lived our own lives and we need to make sure we value the experiences of others. So Al, I'm going to go to you next. Now, I do want to make sure we have time to get to the villain question. So let's try and keep it to these 30 seconds, and then Connor and Darby, I will get to you two next. But Al, what is your feelings? Neurotypical people writing neurodivergent characters.
No, don't do it. I lived this experience and I still worry about getting it wrong. I'm still afraid that I'm not going to do my own authentic self justice on the page. I think if you're trying to figure yourself out, or you're unintentionally writing these characters because you're neurodiverse and you don't realize it, then that's one thing. And as long as you're writing from that authentic personal place, like, I think that's okay. But if you're neurotypical and we as neurodiverse people try to give you ways to write this life experience that you don't have, all we'd end up with is a buffet of cliches that people would pick and choose from, and then they would just end up with a caricature. And if you're trying to get trad published, like you said, I don't condone someone trying to take up the limited seating that we have at the table if it's not their place to do so. It's so limited as it is.
I appreciate that. Darby, I see that you're feeling some agreement here. What are you thinking?
I agree. I agree with Al and really everyone, what they've said. And I'd love to talk about the villain thing when we get to that. So I'll yield my time to Connor.
All right, we will start off with you on that front. And then I see Rachel going, I agree. So Connor, carry us home, and then we'll go into the next question.
All right, I do have a lot to say on this subject because I have seen a lot of people, a lot of neurodivergent people in general, saying like they don't think neurotypicals should be allowed to write from like a neurodiverse point of view, and I'm going to be really contrary here, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little firm, but like I really don't believe in axioms like that. Like it's one of those things where it's like it's fine in theory, but I don't even know how you would ever begin to determine like who's actually neurotypical or neurodiverse in an actual practical sense. I don't think it's ever really as simple as it's us versus the neurotypicals. And I think the propagation of that narrative is pretty actively harmful, especially given how much privilege it takes and like free time you have to use up to responsibly either self-diagnose or obtain a medical diagnosis, especially considering like the compounding layers that marginalization can add with these extra difficulties to the struggle. And I feel like at a certain point, you kind of have to weigh the risks and sort of ask yourself, like, who exactly are we protecting here? Like, who are we keeping safe by being like, no, you can't do this under any circumstances? Because like, I'm aware that there are a lot of autism moms out there trying to hijack the narrative and make it about caregivers or some shit. And like, obviously you need to be held to a set of responsible ethical standards for the narratives you write. But I feel like this kind of standard far and away does significantly more harm to the kinds of people who are unsure whether or not they're neurodiverse or who don't feel neurodiverse enough, or feel like they don't have sufficient evidence of their neurodiversity, and
or don't want to out themselves. Some people might not want to come out and say I'm autistic. And maybe they shouldn't have to write an autistic character.
So I'm gonna pull this back because I hear some good topics and I don't want anyone to misconstrue the good stuff that you're saying. So I'm gonna add in a little bit of buffer here, which is that there is a real difficulty in getting diagnosed if you're an adult, but also if you're a marginalized adult who is not, you know, the typical expected white male sort of fitting in this very small box of autistic symptoms. And I think that neurotypical people, and I should clarify that neurodivergence is obviously not just autism, but we can, speaking as an autistic person, see a rule like do not do this, and we will take it much more black and white than neurotypical people will. Quite often they will see some wiggle room in here of like, well, I see proceed with caution, where we're like, oh, absolutely, we won't if we don't have this diagnosis and this evidence. So I think, Connor, you are making some valid room for people to explore and experiment. I just don't want anyone in the audience to misconstrue you of like, in order to do no harm, we must have no checks and balances, which I don't think is what you were saying.
What I'm trying to say is that I think like I was saying earlier, like you obviously need to be held to a set of like responsible ethical standards for the narratives you're writing, you know. But like I think there are a lot of people who don't know they're neurotypical, who are writing with this as a form of experimentation, or might not even know that that's what they're doing. Right. And I feel like shutting people like that out, or telling them not to try, or being like you're not gonna get it right, like that's not worth the trade-off to me. Yes, like I don't want to see what the neurodiverse version of what happened to Isabel Fall looks like, you know?
I appreciate how you're making this safe place for people to explore. And I think the rest of us were coming at this as we have been wronged so many times by things like Sheldon Cooper and by stereotypes that were like, enough of that, let us protect these fledglings that are trying to make things better. And you're doing the same thing. You're being like, don't shut out those fledglings. Don't make it so they have no room to explore. So we're all coming at this from the same point of view, and you are doing your best to make room that you feel may have been overlooked by the rest of us who are being very protective.
I think it can be, I understand there's a very sort of seductive appeal to being more stringent in who's allowed to write about what, but I would just in general just feel really uncomfortable declaring myself, at least, as a gatekeeper and arbiter of like who's allowed to write about it. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, then even the idea that like you need to be careful about it, that applies to everyone. Like even like neurodivergent people have a lot of you can be neurodivergent and have a lot of internalized ableism. You can still like get out into the world. And so I feel like a lot of those standards would apply to anyone.
Yeah, you have a very good point. We can carry a lot of internalized ableism. Darby spoke on that before. And I see that QuaranCon has given us just a little bit of wiggle room, just a couple extra minutes. So I want to actually jump back to Darby, because Darby, you were really passionate about the villain question. And so I appreciate, Connor, that your passion. I appreciate your
Yeah,
willingness
yeah.
to protect people. And we are going to give Darby space to do the same on the villain question.
Yeah. Well, I'll be brief. I think the question is, how to approach neurodivergent villains, and I think it should be with a great deal of care, as it should be in any case. Hero, villain, side character, main character. But I think for me in my series, the approach I've taken is that the biggest sort of villain in my own life is masking. And I didn't realize that until very late here, and the ways that it's damaging and destructive. And that's the villain in the series, is the mask. And it takes on a comic book sort of dimension, but I wanted to explore the ways in which that can undermine you. And there's some intersections there with the way that society masks and society erases you and forces you to conform, that the mask forces you to do as well, into neurotypical situations that were very appealing to me. And hopefully that works. Hopefully that's successful for readers. But I was fascinated by the idea that you could be your own worst enemy in ways that you're not even aware of.
I so appreciate that. I appreciate that your villain is not like the only neurodivergent character, but rather a commentary, and a commentary that invites people to think more on the subject. And so I know that we've got to wrap this up. We're at 5 o'clock and we've had a lot of good thoughts here. And this is a complicated topic. I see that even in the comments and on YouTube, we've got some complicated thoughts on it. So I'm going to leave everybody with two things. One, listen to neurodivergent people, because we obviously don't all agree, but don't take us at, surface level what you want to hear. Dig into our reasons behind why we're saying something, where we're coming from. And because too often we are misunderstood, misconstrued, and used to support a person in power's point. So really take our passion, listen to us as we generously listen to other people, and go, I now understand where they're coming from. I understand where their passion is from. And I understand why we need this representation, because it should not be on the 8/9 of us here today to teach everybody in the world to listen to us and open their minds. We should have people doing their own research on neurodivergence, whether they are neurodivergent or not, breaking down those biases they may unintentionally or intentionally carry. And so that we get to just be, and we get to thrive, and we get to see ourselves on shelves. And we have more of a trust that we don't have to stop and explain every little thing to people as we're walking down the street, as we're going about our day. We want an accessible world. We want a world that supports our differences. And we want a world where we can thrive without having to be teachers of everyone around us. With that said, I so appreciate everybody who has joined us here today, who took a moment to speak on things, who took a moment to really spend their energy teaching other people. And I encourage everyone to check out these authors online, on social media, their books, and also to keep expanding their world and their minds. So with that, I think we are going to close down for the day. And if you want to see us all later, we've got more to say on social media and in our books. So goodbye for now, and I will awkwardly hang around as we figure out the live chat. So yeah, speakers, if you want to stick around for our after panel chat, I would love to follow up with you. And if you have to run for any reason, go ahead. So let's see here. All right, we should be pausing our live stream soon, and I will get Ryan on the phone.
I wish we could have double time on the panel too. This is